This is Hope Incorporated Australia. We engage with citizens and communities to help achieve better, responsible environmental protection and stewardship, locally, nationally and globally. We work from and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Gayabal, Jadawa and Yugara peoples of southeast Queensland, and we acknowledge our deep respect for the inspiring, protective nature stewardship carried out by First Nations communities around the world for thousands of years. A warm welcome to Imagining 2040 Pathways to Flourishing Futures, a podcast series from Householders' Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia. I'm your host, Andrew Nicholson. In this introductory episode, I want to lay out what we're aiming to achieve and to give you a clear sense of what to expect from the series overall. So, what is this series all about? Well, at its heart, this podcast is an experiment. We're exploring whether podcasting can spark greater public interest in imagining flourishing futures and inspire listeners to push harder, politically and socially, for their realisation. Put it another way, we want to reinvigorate the often overlooked power of future vision public imagination as a force for human development and progress. Imaginative ability to visualise better futures and push for their achievement has played an important role in the modern history of advancing human well-being. Perhaps it's time to rediscover the power of imagination to do the same for us in the 21st century. Ambitious ideas for a humble podcast to support? Some might call it a pipe dream or a mental kite-flying exercise, and there will always be naysayers who insist it's futile to try to change how people think or act. I'm thinking here of the saying, "there's no alternative to the status quo," echoing then UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's famous Tina statement, "there is no alternative." It became a mantra for her promotion of neoliberal economic policies in the 1980s. But we've chosen in this podcast series to ignore the naysayers and do something more imaginative. In fact, it has taken visionary thinking to create this podcast series in the first place, and we're proud to join a small but hopefully growing band of pioneering podcast shows that aim to strengthen public imagination to help visualise better futures 10, 15, 20 years or more ahead. But why focus on the public's use of imagination? For some listeners might ask, isn't the use of imagination already alive and well? Aren't people constantly visualising better futures for themselves and their families? And yes, personal imagination about the future is thriving. People are imagining themselves in better future situations all of the time. And they also often set goals and milestones of achievement to try to make those imagined futures real for themselves, perhaps to get fitter, earn more, live more adventurously. That kind of personal future vision imagination is in use everywhere. But what about collective imagination? What about considerable numbers of people using their imaginations to visualise better futures that could ultimately benefit their communities, regions or nations? And then thinking about the goals and milestones they would need to pursue to make those imagined bigger picture futures more likely to come about. So, are many people today imagining better futures that are climate safe, properly nature protected, more socially supportive and economically fairer? Futures that would leave no one behind? Futures we'd be proud to pass on to future generations? Sadly, research suggests the answer is no. It seems that many people are not spending time imagining better collective futures. It seems there are not many people gathering in communities of interest to share ideas, build visionary roadmaps into better futures, or set goals to aid their achievement. In fact, it seems that quite the opposite situation is occurring. There's growing research that points to what some have called a public imagination deficit, to a lack of so-called futures literacy amongst the wider public, to even what is being termed an imaginary crisis. Whatever we call it, we believe that having too little imaginative thinking about better futures and how they could be made more likely to occur is a serious problem. And here at Hope Incorporated Australia, we've decided to try and do something about that problem, starting with this podcast. But what is the big deal on having too little future vision imagination? Well, the big deal is that without the greater exercise of public imagination, without having increased public futures literacy, without more people regularly imagining better futures and how to achieve them, we risk being stuck with our imagination deficit, and more importantly, stuck with a narrow view of progress that simply extends current trends into the future, stuck with the view that the future is likely to be much the same as the past, perhaps with a few sci-fi additions, and this at a time when there is so much evidence pointing to the opposite conclusion. And we, along with some other imaginative thinkers, believe that such a false sense of assurance about a taken-for-granted future is a dangerous path to be on, a path that could lead us not to flourishing futures, but rather to failing, stagnant, or even collapsing futures. Along with a growing number of other thinkers on the problems we are now facing in the 2020s, we believe this is a time for bold, transformative and transitional changes to solve those problems taken across all sectors of society, not just tinkering with the problems at their edges or kicking the problem cans down the road. We'll come back to explore this issue of the urgent changes needed to deal effectively with our serious interconnected challenges in the episodes to come. But right now, let's touch briefly upon a related, unhappy early chapter of the story of needed transformation and transition to achieve flourishing futures. The chapter called Imagination Deficit in a Time of Failing Development Pathways, a Double Whammy. Look, there's no way to sugarcoat the content of this part of the story. While this podcast is anchored in optimism about the flourishing futures we know are both possible and plausible to achieve, it's also important to acknowledge why that optimism matters so deeply today. Because frankly, on present evidence and current trends, the likelihood of our achieving flourishing development ahead is low. So for this one moment in the series, let's grit our teeth and confront what's at stake, but only if we stay on our current failing development pathways into possible futures. So perhaps consider this as a necessary, if dispiriting, short detour. Frankly, as it stands, we appear to be teetering on the edge of a human progress clifftop, where the quality of life for many, many millions of people around the world is likely to worsen over the coming decades. A growing litany of social, environmental and economic pressures is colliding with a dangerous lack of urgency to address them. Here's just a glimpse of the multiple interconnected challenges we are facing. Climate disruption is intensifying once normal weather patterns, with increasingly fatal and damaging consequences for humans and more than human species. Rising social and economic inequality is eroding physical and mental well-being and helping fuel the rise of extremist political movements and ideologies as distressed people search desperately for answers and support. Nature and natural systems are in decline everywhere, and the collapse of ecosystems and the free vital services they have always provided us will increasingly threaten human health and survival. For instance, we've already crossed most of the science-defined natural planetary boundaries that keep Earth habitable. And while we could list many, many more challenges, we won't, because many of us are already saturated with doom-laden headlines. But we thought it was essential to point out the risks we are increasingly likely to face in failing futures if we don't urgently change course. And there's another section to this story of failing futures to consider. The multiple and growing challenges we are facing, the crises brought on by failing development pathways, are symptoms of outdated development models and the mindsets that sustain them. Together they form what we can call business as usual, a set of entrenched development approaches often powered by corporate greed and the economic encouragement to overconsume, which will almost certainly continue to lead us toward social, environmental and economic dead ends. What's increasingly clear to those who think in bigger picture imaginative ways is this. We need bold, system-level reforms to help us move away from the increasing probabilities of failing futures. We do not need incremental tweaks to our problems and challenges. And we need development models fit for the complexities of the 21st century, not the 20th century. Yet depressingly, such urgent, bold transformations of our currently failing development paths seems unlikely to occur across the relatively short timescales required if we remain captive to business as usual. Even as some of us try to grapple seriously with our challenges, powerful vested interest, financial and political, are hard at work to preserve business as usual and the status quo, because it suits their financial and political bottom lines just fine. And most disturbingly, many elected governments defer to those vested interests, prioritising short-term electoral gains over the longer-term health and well-being of their citizens and ecosystems. Put bluntly, we're shooting ourselves in the developmental foot. We should be focusing on doing the right thing by the planet and not further expanding the pockets of the 1%. Instead, our self-inflicted harms will continue unless we radically rethink how we do development into the future, shifting towards social, environmental and economic models that can regenerate the planet and uplift all life, human and more than human. And so in this podcast, we are proposing one possible antidote to the toxicity of business as usual, and that is to promote the use of future vision, public imagination, and greater citizen-led support to help achieve flourishing futures. So let's thankfully now leave behind that grey-faced glimpse of failing futures and return to the energising purpose of this podcast. Our own vision for Imagining 2040 is to help grow a creative, values-driven community of imaginative thinkers, people who collaborate to share ideas, map out credible, plausible future development pathways and push for their adoption in futures that will be climate safer, properly nature protected, more socially supportive, more economically fair, and more inclusive and intergenerational in their outlooks. Futures that leave no one behind, futures we would be proud to hand on to following generations. Each of our guest interviews will include simple but powerful future visioning exercises designed to spark your imagination and help you picture what a thriving, inclusive and sustainable future could look like for you and your communities. And here's a quick preview of the 3 core imaginative questions we'll be using throughout the series to frame guest interviews. And we invite listeners to adapt them to their own life and use them to begin imagining the kinds of futures they would love to help bring about. Those 3 core exercises and question sets in each guest episode are: time travel to 2040, where you imagine yourself living in a flourishing future and then reporting back on your experience when you return to the present day. An associated question for that exercise is: what did you see, hear and experience in the future you visited? The Signals of the Future exercise involves looking around today and identifying early signs of change which, if magnified and multiplied, could speed our transitions and transformation to better times ahead. Associated questions for that exercise include: what case studies, innovations or movements hint at the potential for deeper transformation? What ideas are worth watching as seeds or signals of better futures? Finally, there is the 3 bold actions exercise based on the imaginative idea that if you could act boldly without resistance, what 3 things would you do to accelerate transformative change into the future starting tomorrow? Associated questions for that exercise include: what 3 steps would you take starting tomorrow that would make a flourishing future more likely and where your actions could not be stopped by business as usual pushback? So if you're curious to explore your own imaginative future visioning, we invite you to adapt these prompts to your life, your community and your aspirations. And if you're looking for a place to start, you could also try adding in this deceptively simple but powerful imaginative question that can often open up a host of future possibilities. That question is: what if? And here's an immediate example of its use. What if increased public future vision imagination could become a tool to resist vested interests business as usual and accelerate our transition towards flourishing futures by 2040? That is a bit of a mouthful, but perhaps worth mulling over as we begin to move towards the end of this episode, and I would not be surprised if you could come up with shorter and sharper examples of what if future possibilities type questions. But just now, let's stay with the notion of thinking about the future more imaginatively and creatively for a little while longer. As the series unfolds, we'll explore key ideas from futures literacy and imaginative futures vision research and practice. One galvanising idea here is that actually there is no single inevitable the future to experience. The future is not a sole fixed destination. That's an imaginative idea in itself. Rather, the future we will come to experience at any one time will emerge from a range of possible futures that are shaped by our collective choices and decisions. Or, as Australian scientist Professor Ian Lowe once put it much more memorably, remember that the future is not somewhere we are going, it is something we are creating. Every day we do things that make some futures more probable and others less likely. So on this type of thinking, multiple futures are possible. The decisions we make today, individually and collectively, determine which futures will become real. And based on such proactive thinking about possible futures, it is possible to understand that we can change development course. We can choose to pursue development paths that serve the many, not the few, and together, in ever greater numbers, we can push for the bigger picture, system-level changes needed to achieve flourishing futures in the decades ahead. Ultimately, we hope listeners will come to see that citizen-led visionary futures thinking could help amplify public calls for transformative changes and just transitions toward better ways of doing development, and thus help fuel the reforms needed to get there. Let's now spend a bit of time on our 4 pilot episodes which kick off the series. These early episodes explore practical opportunities to achieve better approaches to future development and citizen support to help achieve better futures. They cover topics such as art-science collaboration and nature connectedness education, greater citizen involvement in development planning decision-making, using system change leverage points research to achieve better environmental protections, and building visionary community-based alliances to help counter vested interest capture of governments and regulatory institutions. As you listen closely to our guests, you'll hear echoes of the ideas we are exploring in this episode. For example, the need for system-level reforms to our current failing social, environmental and economic ways of doing development. The need for better political representation with far greater inclusion of genuine, citizen-generated decision-making, and the power of increased public imagination to tell and spread many more can-do stories of how we can still achieve genuine human progress. And if you like what you hear, we'll expand the series with more visionary voices, and we'll keep inviting your ideas, your input, and your imagination to help shape our future directions. So as we continue to move through the episode, let's just restate some of the main goals in the series. As the series evolves, our aim is to help listeners practice simple skills of visualizing preferable futures, help listeners think about plausible, better future development pathways relevant to them, and encouraging the gathering of our listeners to share ideas about citizen-led collaborative action which could help make achieving flourishing futures more likely. Our own future vision for the Imagining 2040 podcast series is to create a digital, deliberative public square, a space for listeners to meet, share ideas, and help co-create imaginative futures. Starting with an online podcast community, we hope to extend that into a community of interest in the use of future vision imagination and on into forums, webinars, and perhaps even real-world gatherings. A key message here is that wherever you join us, we want it to be a space where the increased exercise of public imagination leads to a greater chance for real-world demands to achieve flourishing futures. And let's just stay with the importance of listener involvement here, and we will repeat this in every episode. We'd love to hear from you. Throughout the series, we'll invite you to share your visions of preferable futures and the milestones that could help us get there. Suggest future guests and topics. Consider volunteering as co-creators or co-hosts in episodes. Offer ideas to improve the podcast format and reach more people. So we really do hope to be hearing from you, citizens of podcast lands both far and near. And now a word on research foundations. This podcast isn't just a creative experiment or a figment of our imaginations here at Hope Incorporated Australia. It's grounded in a growing body of research on futures literacy and the values of future vision public imagination. We'll be drawing on that work, and with the help of our listeners, we even hope to contribute toward it in some way. After what we hope will be up to 3 years of podcast series development, we'll be trying to answer questions such as, did we manage to boost interest in future visioning amongst our audiences? Did we help to mobilise listeners to think more often and act more boldly toward pushing to achieve flourishing futures? And there'll be other research questions to try and answer along the way, no doubt. Only time will tell whether we can indeed answer these questions, but we do hope you'll stay with us on this experimental, exploratory podcast journey and help us with our research goals. But now, as we come to close this episode, let's return one last time to our key objective, which is to increase the use of public future vision imagination to support flourishing future development. But even as we focus on the future, perhaps it might be worth looking back in time over the last couple of 100 years, and without falling into the trap of romanticising the past as some lost golden age, are there still things we can learn from it in terms of how future vision imagination was being used back then? And let's use a what-if question here to make a link between the past and the possible future uses of imagination. So, what if we still had access to the boldness and bravery of the future vision of imagination that once drove so much major progress on human well-being reform? Past major progress, such as the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, even though slavery still exists in many other forms today, or the expansion of political representation to all citizens in democratic countries, even though the idea of democracy and the rules-based order is under considerable threat today. And what about other past major human well-being reforms achieved out of the exercise of future vision imagination? What about the establishment of worker rights and better conditions of employment, even though those rights and conditions continue to be eroded today? And finally, what about the creation of laws to protect the environment, even though those laws are so often flouted today? All of these substantive reforms to advance human progress began as figments of someone's imagination. They were then made real through the continued values-driven conviction of visionary supporters, through taking assertive political actions, and through the continued collective will and determination of many people to ensure those reforms were implemented. So what might have changed for us in the use of imagination to achieve major beneficial outcomes in human social and environmental progress in these early decades of the 21st century? What might explain our current public imagination deficit and the reduction of imaginary power to help push for visionary, progressive change and reforms which benefit increased well-being for all? Have we perhaps convinced ourselves that human progress is complete? Have we outsourced the need for required changes to institutions that no longer serve us? Frankly, have we lost the cultural energy to imagine, visualise and then push hard to achieve genuine human progress? And when that work is clearly not completed by a long measure, whilst remaining clear-eyed on the limitations of looking to the past for inspiration, can we somehow channel the boldness and bravery of the giant imaginative visionaries of the past to help us with the manifest human well-being problems of our present and futures? I'll leave you for now to ponder these more philosophical questions, and perhaps you'll join us in helping to find some answers down the track. Folks, that's more or less it for our introductory episode. I hope it's given you a good sense of what Imagining 2040 Pathways to Flourishing Futures will be about, and how we plan to explore some of those possible future pathways with you and our guests. Thanks for joining us on this first step of our imaginative journey towards 2040 and beyond. I truly hope you enjoy the pilot episodes and will continue to follow us. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and resources on futures literacy and future vision public imagination, and the specific links tailored to the themes and interests of our various guests in their episodes. And before we go, Let's end with a final round of those semi-magical what-if questions. What if we imagine better futures more often and boldly? What if we acted to achieve them more bravely? And what if we came together in greater numbers with shared visions and in common cause to make flourishing futures real? To stay connected, visit the Hope Incorporated Australia website and social media channels. They'll be promoting the series a few weeks after the pilot episode's launch. In the meantime, please subscribe, share and follow our media to stay in the loop. I'm Andrew Nicholson, producer and host of Imagining 2040 Pathways to Flourishing Futures. Thanks for listening and thank you for imagining with us. Hope Incorporated Australia, providing podcasts, research and community educational outreach to help achieve our vision of a society which is sustainable and just, ecologically, socially and economically. For more details on our work, please visit our website at www.hopeaustralia.org.au.